Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Plan C, Ocean Interventions to Address Climate Change. As always, I'm your host, Will Burns, Co-Executive Director of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at American University, and I'm joined by my co-host, Anna Modlaner, MRV Manager of the Carbon to Sea Initiative. Hi, Anna.
Hi, Will.
Today's guests are two distinguished researchers in the field of ocean alkalinity enhancement. We're joined by Jaime Palter, who is an associate professor of oceanography at the University of Rhode Island, and Dariia Atamanchuk, who is senior research scientist at Dalhousie University. Both Jaime and Dasha are involved in leading one of a handful of research field sites globally studying ocean alkalinity enhancement in the real world, and we'll let them both introduce their individual sites in a minute. We'll hear from Jaime and Dasha about the research questions, as well as some preliminary results and insights from active field research. We've certainly mentioned a number of times on the podcast, but for those of you who are new to the field of ocean alkalinity enhancement, or more broadly, marine carbon dioxide removal, one of the things that's critical are field trials. We need this kind of research to confirm what we've learned in the context of lab or mesocosm research. So, Anna, why did you choose these two researchers to join us for a closing episode wrapping up the year?
Yeah, good questions. Those of us who are deep in the weeds of ocean alkalinity enhancement field research will likely know that 2024 marked a very exciting period with a lot of new insights, learnings, and knowledge generated in the field, thanks to just a handful of key research activities. Jaime Palter is leading a 3-year project funded by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration's National Oceanographic Partnership Program, the NOAA. That acronym is probably going to be mentioned a couple of times, so we throw it out here already. And Dariia, going by Dasha, is a co-project investigator in the Alkaline Project, an international research project funded by us, the Carbon to Sea Initiative, and the Thistledown Foundation, where she leads the observational campaigns of alkalinity research in Halifax alongside Planetary Technologies alkalinity deployment. And we had that team on the podcast 2 episodes ago, so I definitely encourage listening to that. Both Dariia and Jaime serve on Carbon to Sea's Field Research Steering Committee, and in this capacity, I've had many wonderful opportunities to talk with them about the learnings from the field. And last week, both of them gave presentations at the annual American Geophysical Union's meeting in Washington, D.C. And I really wanted to use this opportunity to wrap the year with a look back, where a lot of exciting research and critical research has started to sort of flow in, and that is otherwise perhaps not so widely shared until peer-reviewed research is actually published. So really, it's about sort of sharing with our listeners what some of us that are deep in the weeds and in closed-door rooms get to know about, and make that a little bit more accessible, and also lay the foundation for what's coming in 2025, and we'll already allude to a little bit of a listener surprise at the end of this episode too. So do make sure to listen up until the end.
Great. I'm looking forward to hearing from both of these researchers. As you say, the field's moving quickly, but we have very few in the water research enterprises at this point. So it'll be interesting to see what we've learned to date and what else we need to be doing in the future. So, all right, let's hear from our guest, shall we?
Yes, let's do it.
Welcome, Jaime and Dasha. How are you?
I'm great, thanks.
Great, thanks for having us.
You bet. So let's start simple. Jaime and Dasha, as scientists, what motivates you to study ocean alkalinity enhancement?
Well, I think what first drew me to it was not necessarily the science, which is fascinating, but as a person hoping to do something solution-oriented in oceanography after 20 years of staring at the problem, thinking about something that could at least contribute to a solution was appealing to me.
Yeah, I guess it's the same for me for about 10 years, been studying the carbon cycle and how it's changing as an effect of the climate change and so on. And now for the first time, we we have a privilege to be perhaps a part of the solution. So it's really, really nice feeling to be able to contribute to a solution to climate change.
All right, so let's drill down a bit on that conception of ocean alkalinity as a solution. Let's start with you, Jaime. Can you briefly describe your field research activity?
Yeah, so my field research is sponsored by NOAA, and we are using an opportunistic approach. So one of the major bottlenecks to even studying if ocean alkalinity enhancement can work in the US especially is permitting. Like it's hard to get permits to put something in the ocean to then study its outcomes. And so we thought that using an approach where we watched a land application of alkaline materials, which is already widely used to change the alkalinity and the pH of soils as a soil treatment, and watching that alkalinity come into the coastal environment was a good opportunity to study the way alkalinity influences the carbon system in a very, very shallow coastal environment. And so that's what we've been doing for the last year, and we have 1 year of field season ahead of us. There's a golf course right by a coastal lagoon. They're putting limestone on the soils, and we're measuring the soil pH, with a huge team, the groundwater alkalinity and pH, and dissolved inorganic carbon, and then in the coastal lagoon, all the carbon chemistry there as well.
Interesting. Dasha, what are you working on in Halifax?
So for the past 2 years, we've been running large-scale ocean alkalinity enhancement trials here in Halifax Harbor, Eastern Canada, in collaboration with a climate tech company called Planetary Technologies. And most of my research activities includes observing alkalinity releases and their effects on the carbonate cycle and the water. You can most often see me and my team in the harbor on the boat taking water samples or deploying some robotic platforms. The robots collect measurements autonomously while us on the boat taking water samples using Niskin devices and similar equipment. My research goals in this project is to develop the monitoring, reporting, and verification methods that will combine field observing that I'm doing together with the modeling efforts to assess the risks and benefits of the ocean alkalinity enhancement and whether it can be done safely at scale and whether we can actually quantify the carbon uptake associated with the ocean alkalinity enhancement. Yeah.
Great. And why do you think, either one of you or both of you, why do you think that that field research, as opposed to some of the more elemental sort of research, is critical in this context of moving forward our understanding of ocean alkalinity enhancement, including MRV?
Let's see. I think, this is in no way an either or situation. So there's excellent benchtop work being done at the lab scale where they're and actually think there should be more of it, looking at like even just the physical chemistry of how these materials dissolve is really interesting. There's mesocosm experiments where there's large tanks of whole seawater, and people looking at the ecological impacts there. And then there's where we kind of fit in the field research, trying to figure out what is measurable. I think that's a question in itself. Like, what can we expect to be able to pull out when you're trying to when companies eventually or any entity is trying to responsibly add something to the environment, you want to keep the dose low enough that there's not an ecological consequence. And that might be so low in the ocean environment that it's very hard to measure. And I think that's what a lot of us are finding. So the field work is really saying what's both safe and measurable at the same time. And I think that's where the field work comes in. And then, of course, we partner also with modeling communities where we're asking what happens after the signal is no longer measurable. And it's kind of, we know it's there, but it's such a small signal relative to the noise in the system that the models are necessary to track the fate and put uncertainties around it. So I think all the legs of the stool, from the most basic benchtop science in the lab all the way through field and modeling are all very important.
Great. Anything to add to that context, Dasha?
Yeah, I think I will approach this from slightly different point, saying that, control environment in the lab is great. We can design our experiment to address, to answer one question or the other about, the risks, the thresholds that ecosystem may withstand or not. However, if we go out in the natural environment, it's so much more complex than anything that we can reproduce in the lab, that to me, it kind of necessitates the large scale field trials, because they have absolutely different focus. We are looking at the big picture now and trying to understand as a whole whether the system is being affected in any meaningful way. Another part of it is that only by running these large scale field trials, we can assess the risks and the benefits of, one of MCGR method that's under question. And and really tell something about the future scalability of this method, to be able to remove, as we are talking about now, 10 gigatons of carbon per year by 2050.
And both of you have adverted to the significance of your research to MRV, or monitoring, reporting, and verification. Could you explain to me what your conceptions of MRV are in the context of ocean alkalinity enhancement?
Actually, I think of my research as like more basic research, and I think of MRV as something, it's measuring or monitoring, reporting, and verification, which is like someone measures a change or monitors a change in the ocean, reports it to a third party, and the third party verifies it, which has like a meaning beyond the science. So I think this one will be really good for Dasha, who's working with one of these private companies that's required to do that MRV work.
Yeah, I think to me, as I'm doing this research and being involved, not only in doing research, but actually interacting with our industry partner and understanding what's their interest in all this enterprise. To me, MRV emerges as a system of checks and balances to assure that application of marine carbon dioxide removal is safe, it's reasonable, it's net beneficial for all involved. But I guess first and foremost, that it's actually helping mitigate the climate change by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So we yet to show that, we can suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere by applying alkaline material to the ocean.
Yeah. Building on that answer a little bit, and you'll see me smile because I've had this conversation with both of you individually in the past. There is no clear path or process, I think, where learnings from field research are directly transferable to one MRV rule or one set of protocol that prescribes how a company should be doing MRV. And I would like to hear a little bit more about where you think both of your individual research activities have a shared approach to MRV, and where whatever you are finding and what comes out of your research is directly sort of transferable and comparable, and where you think, the underlying assumptions or the underlying infrastructure and even scientific processes might be so different that it is, not directly one rule that can be derived from it. So that's a long way of just asking to provide the listeners a little bit with an idea and sense for where where both of your research activities are very similar and where they are different.
Well, yeah, it's great that we just got back from AGU, because we got to catch up a little bit and see how the other ones, what each other is up to. I would say where we're similar is that we both think that if you're going to do an alkalinity enhancement field trial or deployment, that you should show that you raised the alkalinity, right? Like that's kind of a starting point, and that should be done observationally. And so for that, you should measure the alkalinity and measure and baseline it, look at the baseline, and then look at the change from that baseline. And I think where we're different in that is that in this opportunistic approach, I'm looking for a signal to wash into the ocean on the time scale that nature happens. So the limestone goes down on the soils. The soil pH does rise over like weeks to months. The groundwater alkalinity appeared to rise. Actually, it was really dramatic rise in the alkalinity, but it started a little bit before the limestone went down, which was a mystery. But then when we try to track the signal into the ocean, there's so much noise that it is quite a challenge. So that we are very grateful to have a second field season to try to suss this out. Whereas, like, I don't want to put words in Dasha's mouth, so I'll hand it off to her. But I saw her evidence that it's that they are having measurable signal in the water column.
Yeah. Before we went there, Jaime, could you explain a bit more about the noise factors that are kind of potentially bedeviling the measurements?
Yeah. So basically we go out weekly and collect bottle samples. So like Dasha, we're out in the water in a small boat. The students particularly, I have to give them a shout out because they're doing most of the hard, often cold work. They go out and collect bottles of water from this coastal lagoon, what we call salt pond here in Rhode Island, every week. And from that, we can construct like an alkalinity-salinity relationship. And that's so important because the alkalinity and it is coming in, or that changing alkalinity is coming in the groundwater, which has a salinity of essentially 0. The pond water is a mixture of open ocean water and groundwater. So if there's more open ocean water, then the alkalinity of the open ocean is really the dominant signal. So if we can plot the alkalinity versus salinity, that lines up on a pretty straight line between these two end members, like the ocean water and the groundwater. And so we're looking for a change in the end member that signifies the groundwater. But most of our measurements, when you go out there weekly, you just are whatever tide happens to be in the morning, that Wednesday morning that you go out. And so we're sampling mostly at salinities that would suggest that we're in 90 to 99% ocean water. And we're looking for a signal in that last 5 to 10% of the groundwater that comes in. So that brings in a lot of noise. And then on top of it, there's a seasonal cycle. The calcifiers, like oysters, clams, barnacles, they are temperature sensitive and they draw alkalinity out of the water. So there's a lot, there's the two end member mixing, and then there's biological sources and sinks. And so with all of that, it's all stuff going on in our coastal system. And we're trying to find this small signal in this source water. Although it shouldn't be that small. I mean, the groundwater changed quite a lot. So we still have hope that we can see it, but the lessons we learned about how to observe it, we're going to refine our methods and go back this year.
Yeah, so let's hand it over to Dasha. Hear your perspective.
Yeah, thanks. I think to me, I should say that there will be, of course, some commonalities, some lessons learned that we can share among different sites. But I should also point out that each site would be individual in its own way. An example of a salinity-alkalinity relationship that Jaime was talking about is quite going to be the case everywhere, especially in the coastal environment. We have these multiple sinks and sources of natural alkalinity that currently are not well observed. So it's really hard for us to tell if we don't know much about the environment, where the signal that we see is actually caused by alkalinity addition, or it's just, an enhanced groundwater inflow. So one of the lessons learned that we see is that there is a need to characterize all the sinks, all the sources of carbonate system in the coastal environment before we can actually start interpreting the signals that we see with high degree of confidence and attributing them to actually addition of alkalinity, and then as a result, the uptake of carbon from the atmosphere. one of the common features, I guess, is that both Jaime and I using quite similar tools. We both do water sampling. We also both use similar sensors that measure, carbon dioxide in the water, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, salinity, temperature. So I guess some of the instrumentation that we're using and the methods could be shared, but applied in the different way. And, the sampling frequency or the monitoring frequency, if we're talking about the sensors, they need to observe the full tidal cycle, which is impossible with the water sampling. So we'll have to turn to autonomous sensors and platforms to help us with that. Yeah, so there is that. So there is a lot that we could learn from each other collectively. But also there will be always, each side will be highly, highly specific, I would say. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is one of the biggest challenges, as you said, in this field. I wanted to come back to one thing that, Jaime, you said in the beginning that both of you have sort of learned and realized, which is this importance of actually measuring an alkalinity signal. Can you say a little bit more about why that is relevant? Is it, quote unquote, purely to demonstrate, yes, I have actually indeed raised my alkalinity? Or are you able to derive more, I guess, relationships to other parameters from that? Like, what is the implication really of measuring alkalinity?
I think the reason I start there is because I think the listeners know at this point that ocean alkalinity enhancement means you raise the alkalinity of the seawater in order to shift more of the dissolved inorganic carbon out of the CO2 pool into the bicarbonate pool, creating a CO2 deficit at the surface ocean relative to what it had been, or like the counterfactual where this intervention didn't happen, and either drive more CO2 into the ocean or prevent CO2 from leaving the ocean. Okay. So with that, there's like various points that you could say, I want to measure to make sure this worked. But like, I think at a minimum, since the intervention starts with adding alkalinity, you want to show that you've measured alkalinity. In some cases, like, if you're adding a pure liquid alkalinity source or a diluted liquid alkalinity source, it's already dissolved. The only thing the real reason to do it at that point, because you could just measure what you're putting in, is to make sure that you don't have secondary precipitation. So that it doesn't precipitate out and then you lose the efficiency of your dosing of putting the alkalinity in the ocean. But I think that is like that would be a very pure experiment where you have a liquid alkalinity source. But most people are talking about using rocks to do this, and pulverized rocks, like little tiny pebbles, basically. And those we need to make sure dissolve. And so if someone's going to put a rock feedstock in the ocean to cause ocean alkalinity enhancement, I think we should measure that it dissolved and caused the alkalinity shift. I think that's like kind of a minimum. And if you measure that near the source, and you get the alkalinity change and you don't see the secondary precipitation, it will dilute outside of that source. And so I think maybe you wouldn't have perfect confidence, but you'd have some confidence that it's not going to precipitate further, since the dilution should make that even more unlikely to happen. So that's why for me, the starting point.
So it's a way of sort of, in the scientific aspect, I guess, confirm hypotheses. And from a truly sort of market MRV standpoint, it is a way to ensure your efficiency is sort of following or your calculations are following all rules of efficiency, which means you didn't have alkalinity losses in that sense.
Yeah, I think so.
Right. Okay. And the other thing I wanted to drill down on is the salinity-alkalinity relationship. What do you think the implication of that is? Is there a future where sort of, showing more science around this regard makes OAE more predictable, or makes it more provable or quantifiable? Or what is impactful in discovering this salinity-alkalinity relationship?
We didn't discover, I mean, this is not a new discovery. This has been known, I don't know, as long as I've been in the field, it's been in the textbook. So a long time.
Okay.
So, seawater has higher alkalinity than fresh water. And so, if you think of any, systems can be more complicated than two end members because you can have ocean water from different places with different sources and sinks. But if you think of it that way, then like the fresh water's delivering water from the terrestrial environment, rivers, groundwater, etc., will have an average alkalinity of something, let's say a few hundred, and the ocean water will have an alkalinity of something else, say a couple thousand, 2,000, and then everything kind of mixes along a mixing line. So a linear relationship typically emerges for any ocean region, and that's been known for ages. So when you're looking for your perturbation, it's much easier to look for a perturbation relative to that relationship than you can't just look at alkalinity because that's the first thing to control for is the salinity. Dasha, would you add to that?
Yes, salinity-alkalinity relationship is something we've been struggling with for a long time, right? Okay, so where do we start here? It's of course, so I think being able to show that we are measuring alkalinity that's above the baseline is the minimum, right? It tells us that we indeed increased alkalinity of seawater. It does not tell us yet, however, that it caused changes in partial pressure of CO2 that will eventually cause the uptake of carbon. So we are not at that stage yet, at least in my field trials. We are measuring it. We are still to tell with certainty and say with certainty that, that alkalinity signal translated into the depleted CO2 in seawater. So that's one thing. And then I think coming back to your question about, why we're measuring alkalinity, why is it important? So besides the losses due to secondary precipitation, as Jaime mentioned, we need to monitor alkalinity in order to know what is the exposure zone of our addition, and that in turn informs about the potential ecosystem responses within that zone. If we define a threshold above which alkalinity cannot exceed that threshold and above which it starts affecting ecosystems, we have to be mindful of that. So this is one of those, I guess, straightforward parameters that we need to measure in order to tell how far our plume disperses and what effects it might have on the ecosystems. And overall, it's measuring alkalinity is a first step in this chain of that is needed for us to go from alkalinity addition to the uptake of carbon.
Okay, so that leads me naturally to my next question, which is that chain. What happens of course, in particular, Dasha, in your case, in your collaboration with Planetary, what happens with the data? How are you contributing to the quantification eventually of the actual carbon removal? And, in the chain that you just described, what are the next steps and how is that data flow currently happening, I guess, between you and Planetary? So if you want to speak a little bit to that and what you're learning.
Yeah, absolutely. This collaboration with Planetary was great for us, especially for me as a field observer. I need a perturbation to observe. I cannot just, without it, my research, I think, would be much, much harder to do. So from our perspective, the data sharing and collaboration's been really great. Not only we've got all the information we needed from the Planetary technologists to perform our independent research, because of course we are pursuing different goals here, right? But we are working in collaborations. For us, academic research is about, assessing the viability of this method as a potential climate mitigation solutions. For Planetary Technologies as a climate startup, they probably looking in some, economic gains, financial gains in the future. But regardless, we learned, how to work together, how to benefit from this collaboration. And we are working in such tight collaboration that we could, Planetary is willing to assist us with some targeted releases. If we know about the question that is absolutely important and vital to answer, they would, change their operation schedule to satisfy, our needs. So, for example, add alkalinity feedstock at a different rate, and then maybe pause for a while we're doing some research. And, alkaline data, the ocean alkaline data, the project that we're working on will be made eventually publicly available after we finish the QC. And it's my understanding that Planetary is also being very open about their data. So if there's a need to access any of their records, I think they are quite open to that too. Yeah.
Okay. And so to your point from earlier, measuring alkalinity is the first step, and then eventually the observations are handed over to the model, and the model indicates how much carbon has been removed. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that relationship is established between observations and models in reality? Sort of, we hear about this a lot in theoretical terms, and I think it would be great for the field to know that this, people are doing it. It's happening. So yeah, if you have a little bit of insight there, that would be awesome.
Yeah, great. So, okay. So the measurements we collect actually serve two purposes. One purpose is to actually validate the model that's already established, to make sure it actually works and represent the natural variability correctly. And then the second part is to ensure that the measurements we are collecting can be used to validate the model when it's in the perturbation mode, right? So it would be really hard to detect the signals that we are detecting now in terms of alkalinity and partial pressure CO2 in the far field, so not next to the addition point because of the dilution rates, and that's not what we want, right? We don't want to exceed the threshold. That's why the quantities of alkalinity we add in are not that great, allowing us to detect the signal when it dilutes further. But the way it works is that we construct the model, and then we use observations to iterate the model so that it improves its parameterization, improves its representation of the processes. And eventually, the model will use the alkalinity data that we collect in the field to calculate the deficit of carbon that is created in the water as a result of alkalinity addition, and then using the parameterization of the ARC exchange, calculate how much of the carbon being taken up per square meter, either close to the addition point or somewhere in the far field. It would be really hard to do the measurements and verification like that without having the model, because we just don't have the capacity to observe carbon cycle and carbon uptake at the scale that model allows us to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's, really helpful, I think. And before we sort of cross over to a bit more, I guess, general accounts of your experience and challenges, Jaime, I wanted to ask one last deep scientific question, which is something that you brought up last week during your AGU presentation. You said that some of the measurements you've been collecting are consistent but deeply ambiguous. And I wanted to follow up on that and hear a bit what you mean by it and why it's important.
I think that reference was talking about the arrival of the total alkalinity change in the salt pond, in the coastal lagoon. And the fact that we could estimate the expected change in alkalinity based on the groundwater change using, again, that 2 end member mixing, curve and the observations in the salt pond of salinity and alkalinity. And when we looked at that, this is like a really technical answer, but the intercept, that 0, so our fresh end member, was kind of the change was about what you expected, a few hundred micromolar TA, which is actually quite a big perturbation. But that projection to the intercept was made with observations all on the salty end of the curve. So it's like this, you set this question up well in a few questions ago. It's like we have a mixture that's no less than 90% seawater. And we're trying to find the signal in that 10% groundwater. And so I would just say it is consistent, but I'm not sure it's convincing, right, to project that curve. So that is what I meant by that. And I think we just keep going and take more observations and see what we can learn. And something that Dash and I also have in common is that we're using these PCO2 sensors from a company in Halifax called Oceanic. The sensors have been working fine for us. We both saw each other's data, so I think it's okay to say that. Maybe you can confirm if that's true. The sensors are working fine in the sense that they're recording CO2. They're like highly consistent with one another. I have 5 of them in this tiny salt pond, so they're highly correlated. But the CO2 signal, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, PCO2, is very, very, very sensitive to photosynthesis and respiration. And the biology is kind of dominant. It's king in this system. So the photosynthesis and respiration causes wild swings daily. When the sun comes out, they draw CO2 out of the seawater. And when the sun goes down, they respire it back out, these phytoplankton. And so those swings can be 200 microatmospheres. And then the swing between like what the tidal cycle of a couple parts per thousand of salinity, which means like at high tide we have more seawater and at low tide we have more groundwater in our mixture. That swing is like 50 to 70. It's not small. The sensors are like nominally can measure differences of 3 microatmospheres. So that 70 is big, but it's in a background of a diurnal cycle of hundreds. And so to get a convincing shift in PCO2 means really knowing and being able to control for or remove this biological signal. The chemical signal is very, very small on top of it. And I think that's another commonality between us and a reason the models become important, because what we really want to know is that the surface ocean changed its CO2 and that deficit was replaced by air-sea exchange with the atmosphere. And I think Dash and I are kind of our work in its different ways is showing what the effort required to actually see the PCO2 change and what we think is going to be possible even with best practice. Is that fair?
That's a really great point. I want to stress a little bit on that. I guess in this context of what is field research teaching us and how is that able to transfer over to sort of scaled up processes, that's a really, really important point that you just made. I don't know, Dasha, you look like you wanted to add something to it.
Yeah, I'd like to add that for MRV purposes, as a result of our research, I think the research that Jaime is doing and I'm doing will independently show that there are a set of parameters that can be measured, and there and we should be able to distinguish them against the background of natural variability. And there are signals that are just so highly variable that there is a high the signal from alkalinity enhancement is associated with higher uncertainty, and the relative value of these parameters and our able to detect the change will depend on not only the location but also on the available sensor technology and available methods to detect this change. And to the point about the interactions between observations and modeling is that with the measurements alone, we just observe a kind of a mixed bag of processes, and we have to, control for biological production and respiration. We need to control for temperature-related solubility changes, and then based on that, try to see what that small signal from alkalinity addition turns out to be. With a model, all this can be done in real time in much more efficient way. And eventually, I think this combination of modeling and observations should be able to get us where we want to be in terms of, trying to quantify the uptake of carbon from the atmosphere. But on its own, the measurements and models are not good enough.
So let me ask you a question that's probably more than a bit unfair, but always one that I'm interested in the context of this research. Do you think that MRV approaches ultimately can be conducted both in a manner that provides a high sense of certainty in terms of our ability to measure sequestration, and at the same time wouldn't be so cost preclusive that it would price alkalinity enhancement out of the carbon markets?
I can see why it's unfair, because I'm so far from the economics of this that I'm not sure, but I would say not yet. Like, if you're gonna do this right, you're gonna spend a lot of money trying, because we just are still this is my opinion now. We're really in that learning curve. And I think anywhere we can make strides to figure out the kind of necessary and sufficient suite of measurements and model requirements that would give you confidence, right? That you've removed carbon and plus or minus some percent uncertainty, until that system is not bespoke for every single system where it's deployed, and not still like under establishment. What are those minimum requirements? And how do we do them? And what's the efficient way? And do we build out labs that like are just cost centers that are just running these bottles all the time? I think it's going to stay expensive for a little while to come. And I don't think, and that won't compete, particularly if we have, junk on the market that it's competing with. If people can price in the first of a kind to nth of a kind, I don't know how long before that's dialed in. Maybe someday. And I would definitely need to hand that off to someone who is more knowledgeable than me, but that it could become more cost effective.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on that context, Asha?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I start thinking about this exact question, and the research I'm doing also, kind of starts being tailored to answer the question, not necessarily satisfied, but maybe, give an answer. I see it as a there's a two-way problem. One is we need to build a model. We need to build a reliable model that will represent, the natural conditions and will help us to see the perturbations against the background. So that's number one. And in order to establish this model, we need to perform the set of measurements, observations that will help us improve it. The next stage, and I think this is something you're talking about, Bill, is we need to make this operational. What does it mean to become operational? Does it mean 2-3 measurements 100 meters away from each other, or does it mean a single sensor that's measuring in one location 24/7? I think once we figure out what it is, we can start looking at economics of it. Other people can start looking at the economics of it. But we at least can provide an answer what we think the MRV should look like. And again, coming back to the models, this is something that models can inform us about. They can tell us what is the most sensitive region geographically, what is the most sensitive parameter, chemically and physically. And then knowing this information, we can then hand it over for people to start thinking about the economics of it.
Yeah, could I jump one more time in? Because this is a point I like to make that I think is complementary to this, a little bit of advocacy, which is that I think academic research, if we can channel some of the work to do this into the academic sphere, I think the payback is really high, because this is where students are trained to become professionals. They're the people who can run the operational lab someday. You also get kind of a curiosity factor, a care, like to the research, while we're still in this kind of first of a kind domain where there's enough incentive for the young scientists to like make their name doing this, write their dissertations or master's theses. And then we train the next generation. And so I think there's a high payback for that. If we can channel the resources, and a kind of agnosticism, like there's no incentive in the academic sphere. There should be high disincentive to do any kind of fabrication. There's no profit motive. It's just the science to learn the truth is at its best, at least. And I think that there is something to be said for that.
Yeah, and eventually the scientists who know the truth are also going to be required in the private sector, right? If this is actually to scale, that does also open up opportunities for employment and activities outside of academia for those where that might not be their chosen path of career or whatever, right? Like if we think about people who actually do MRV in the sort of commercial sense, then it becomes actually very, very crucial that people are trained in it. And I don't think we have enough people who know the ins and outs, or very limited people, limited amount of people who know the ins and outs.
Yeah, if I can also add to this question of scale, because this is also something I keep thinking about a lot. If we were to scale this operation up to a point where it becomes meaningful, that after, we prove or disprove whether this method actually works and it's safe and it's verifiable, we'll need more and more scientists to scale it up to a point where it becomes meaningful. And that involves not just scientists working on the projects, but also scientists advising the policymakers, decision makers, providing an informed, opinion that is based in facts and truth and science, rather than, speculations and all that. So there is a need for training the next generation of environment professionals that are both versed in science, but also versed in communicating science to promote the whole climate mitigation research.
Yeah, I think those are really important points. We don't discuss enough, in my opinion, in the field, among the million things we need to discuss, right? That this idea of skills building, right, and what we're going to need and how we're going to effectuate that. So thanks to both of you for that. So let me ask you a broader question. Given both of your expertise in this field, when you look beyond your own research this year at research findings or propositions from other labs, other researchers, what intrigued you the most, and what do you think might be the most helpful in terms of furthering this field?
And start perhaps because we're just back from EGU meeting right in DC, and it's just mind blowing. There's so much happening. It's really hard to keep track on everything that's happening. But I was just impressed by the pure scale of research that's happening in very different CDR topics. It goes from, lab experiments, mesocosm experiments investigating the ecotoxicity of, alkalinity or its metals or whatever. So it's really like a very comprehensive approach that's happening right now in terms of investigating the potential risks and benefits of ocean alkalinity enhancement. At the same time, there is a really strong push to do more of the field trials, and I think Carbon to Sea is being a huge locomotive in that, helping to establish these test sites, but also helping to bring researchers into the already established test sites in order to do their research. So there's that. And also, I see a lot of similar action happening, not only in the ocean alkalinity space, but also in enhanced weathering and other MCDR methods. So I think collectively we can learn from the successes of each other. And I think that's what's really helped to push this whole research agenda forward, is that there is a concerted effort, multidisciplinarily, multi-sectoral, where everyone is involved, and we see a lot of support.
Dasha, I want to pick up on that point you just made about learning across pathways. In particular, jumping back to Jaime and something that you showed at AGU last week, is around the interplay and collaboration between enhanced rock weathering and ocean alkalinity enhancement. You showed a video of the golf course runoff. It was like a frontal video on the sediment, I don't know, like maybe a meter high, and you showed how the water sort of flows out of the sediment into the lagoon, which is almost a parallel video or image of what I saw 2 days before at a enhanced rock weathering workshop. And I'm curious how you think these very related sort of cousins of carbon removal approaches could elaborate and enhance their collaboration. Why do you think they are treated as separate sort of pathways right now? Or maybe you are already sharing learnings a bit, but it would be great sort of to wrap the episode with a bit of a broader lens on these different approaches and how you think about it.
I'll do my best. I think, yes, I do think that that's well put. They're cousins. It's basically like take an alkaline material, usually a rock. So find a way to speed up its reaction with carbonic acid, but with CO2. And then that when it happens on land, I think the underlying assumption is that much of the formed bicarbonate, once the alkaline rock has reacted with the carbon dioxide to form bicarbonate and carbonate, it will end up in the ocean. And so they're really not so different. It's like where the reaction happens might be the main difference. And then there's also players like Carbon Run putting alkalinity in rivers to cause the reaction in the river water, which eventually runs into the ocean and not that over that long a time. So I think all of this, I mean, as an oceanographer, I love to think of the ocean as the center of the universe anyway. A lot of this is like either we get carbon to go into the ocean because the wind drives it in at the ocean surface, or we get more carbon into the ocean because it dissolves in groundwaters and river waters and lake waters and eventually flows in. And it's a storage place for it. So I think you're right that there's a lot we can learn from each other. I've been really pleased. I mean, this is like a tiny personal example, but Noah Planavsky from Yale joined up with us to take these soil samples. That wasn't part of the original NOAA project. And he's going to run his column model and try to figure out like the dissolution kinetics in the soils. So I think that two-way communication has started in miniature for our project, but I think that there could be more of it. I think knowing what feedstocks, how fast they dissolve and how much their impurities mobilize is something that we should really be talking about and sharing, because I think that those are shared concerns with parallel research tracks. And I think that the field is coming around to seeing these two as being some of the more promising. Like geophysically, these are very promising pathways. And then in terms of like the and there's so much science to do, but there's also just a lot of like all the other stuff, social acceptance, economics, regulation, all of those things. And I think that's, that equally has to go in parallel by other experts in their respective domains.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a great sort of opening plaidoyer. Is that a word in English? To the community. And maybe if you want to just say a couple of closing words, what you think you're excited about in 2025 and what your key sort of message to decision makers, funders, just policymakers, I guess, is, and then we'll wrap it up.
So for me, as we enter the third year of field trials, I'm very excited to see what extra knowledge we get this year, because we learned a lot so far. And now, but also we know how to do things. We know exactly the answers we want the questions to. So that wasn't quite a case in the first year, let's say, because it was so, fast paced. And just, seeing more and more of these field trials actually happening and making sure that, from the policy standpoint, from decision making and funding, these are being enabled for the reasons I think we talked about before, in order to assess the true potential of ocean alkalinity enhancement at scale. We need to do these experiments at scale.
That's a great yeah. I think I want to take, since we're getting towards the end, I want to take the time, because I didn't touch on it yet, which is that we have these amazing partners at the Environmental Protection Agency doing, like, looking for sensitivities of the biology to any changes in the groundwater chemistry, to the carbon chemistry in the salt pond. And they're doing tremendous work. And I think, so one message, for that big group that you just spelled out, is that these partnerships are really important to all of us. Like, the EPA needs to figure out even the methods to evaluate ecological safety. And so this partnership is giving them a pathway to doing that. I think, preserving those partnerships and strengthening them is key. I think, and then the other message that springs straight from that experience is that, the signal, even in a place where we expect to see it, like, remember, I'm saying that we should be seeing changes of the order of, that should be measurable by all of our different methods. And it's still very hard to see because of all of the noise and, like, the environmental background variability relative to the signal that we're trying to find. That means that when they go to look at the ecological changes, they're comparing a site with a hypothetical change that we haven't even been able to measure with another site that shouldn't have that hypothetical change, and comparing environmental variability to environmental variability. And that's uncomfortable, because it's like, can we assess the safety when we can't even measure the change? So I think one of the messages I've been trying to articulate when I talk about ocean alkalinity enhancement is that we have a real measurement challenge, because we're trying to measure a small signal in an ocean of noise and in a huge amount of background variability. But I want people to think of that as the good problem. That's the good place to be in. We want the measurement challenge is something that scientists can dig their teeth into and possibly solve. That's a much better problem than if we're making a perturbation so big that we really have ecological fears. When we can't even measure the chemical change to even to look for the ecological change, that's a much better position to start from. And so I think those are my main messages: is academic and agency partnerships in the US, and then maybe even with private partnerships, those can be very valuable, as we're seeing with Dasha and Planetary's work together. And that those partnerships should lead us to, like, finding these small signals in an ocean of huge variability. And that the measurement problem is definitely a challenge, one we're all grappling with. But that's the better challenge to have than one with an ecological impact that you can measure, right? And so those are my messages.
Great. Great. Well, that's an inspiring place to end the episode. Once again, I'd like to thank Jaime and Dasha for joining us on the pod. We look forward to future reports about your research and its results. I'd also like to thank our listeners, and as always, make sure to subscribe, like, and rate our podcast wherever you're hearing it. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the news to others. Additionally, if you have ideas or suggestions for future episodes as we move into 2025, please feel free to contact us. We're always open to inspiration. And with that, we'll say goodbye now.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Bye.
Before we let you go into the well-deserved holidays for those who celebrate, we wanted to ask you a little favor. We would love to hear from you, our listeners, what you thought was particularly exciting and worth celebrating in the field of ocean-based climate solutions in this past year or before, as well as what you are hoping to achieve and see happening in 2025. We'd like to hear what we should be celebrating, what should keep all of us going, and what we've learned this year, in your opinion. Send us a quick voice note via speakpipe.com/Plan C podcast, which is also linked in our show notes. And if you like, we will feature you in our first episode of 2025. Happy holidays and Happy New Year.